Coming up, the Nets season hasn't made much sense at all, and maybe that's just okay. Plus, some highlights and lowlights as we head out of the All-Star break. We'll get into all of that, but first, theme music.
You are Locked On Nets, your daily Brooklyn Nets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, welcome back to the Locked On Nets podcast on the Locked On Podcast Network. It's your team, the Brooklyn Nets, every single day. I'm Doug Norrie, no Adam Armbrecht in the house today as we roll through the All-Star break. Looks a little bit of a downtime in the NBA schedule, a little bit of downtime for one Mr. Adam Armbrecht. It'll be a little downtime for me next week. That's just going to way that's going to work out with the podcast. Happy to have everyone here as we continue to roll through an absolutely crazy Brooklyn Nets season, which we'll talk about here on a make it make sense level, and we'll talk about a little bit about who some of the highlights or what some of the highlights have been from the first. It's not the half of the season, though. The All-Star break can definitely throw you off around that, and then some of the lowlights too, like who's really outperformed expectation, who's maybe underperformed expectation. And all that along the way. And like I said, with the All-Star break, you start to think to yourself, oh, maybe we're like halfway through the season. But obviously the Nets we're considerably more than halfway through the season, 54 games into an 82 game schedule. So not at the halfway point, but that's just the way the All-Star weekend works out. I will say, just as a high level note, if you're looking for any high level or low level All-Star break analysis, this is the wrong place to have done it. This is not something that interests me personally at all. I know in the NBA landscape, it's a fun talking point. You can get some, funny memes out of it. You can get some hair pulling when it comes to, if people aren't hitting sort of expectations around the entertainment level of the All-Star break, but that's just not how I roll. I just can't get into it. I can't get into the skills challenge of the 3-point contest or the dunk contest or even the games themselves. So, hey, if it makes me less of a fan, that's just the way it is. Although the wind outside, as you can probably hear coming through the the podcast, maybe the wind disagrees with me as we're getting what feels like, I don't know, borderline hurricane level winds outside. There's just no way to muffle that. So yeah, it's outside. It's a stormy, windy, sort of, unrelenting outside, sort of like the NBA season has been so far. So no All-Star break analysis coming from this guy. I did want to just ring in quickly about a little bit what we talked about with yesterday's podcast, and then kind of piggybacked on Lucas Kaplan, friend of the show from Nets Daily, who's probably the best just sort of Nets writer that there is right now, or we've seen in a long time. He's excellent on a high level in terms of just talking about the team, all the way down to an X's and O's level. We've been really gifted as a community, I think, Nets fans over the years, of having some just really great people talking about this team sort of consistently that really understand basketball really well. Like I said, from a functional and just sort of technical level, and are able to write. Like that's no easy feat. I know some people want to think themselves sort of experts around how basketball is dissected. And it's not an easy thing to do. So Lucas, who has been on the show multiple times, did write an essay for Nets Daily, and it sort of mirrored a lot of what we talked about. It says the title of it's what do we make of a Brooklyn Nets season that above all doesn't make any sense. And I thought he did a good job of describing the feelings around this season, sort of the competing ideas around what this season should be, could be, and then ultimately will be when we get to the end of it, and just kind of highlights around where probably a lot of this frustration comes from. And a lot of times frustration comes from confusion, or a lot of times when we're frustrated with things, it's confusion around sort of a misunderstanding around base principles, right? So you'll be frustrated because you're confused around someone's reaction to something, or why you're confused around why something's not working out the way you want it to, or you believe that one thing was going to happen and another thing can happen, and that leads to frustration. But the frustration stems from confusion because you're just like, oh my God, this just really doesn't line up with my worldview, or it doesn't line up with the way I think how things should work, or it doesn't line up with outcomes that should have been the case when XYZ happened, and then another outcome ended up happening. And I think that's where this frustration among the fan base, or I guess just the fan base in general, happens, is around this confusion. And I thought Lucas does a good job of talking about this in terms of, he starts off by reminding everyone that, we should enjoy the wins. And I think maybe sometimes Adam and I, maybe me more than Adam, sort of forget that. Like, wins are fun. Like, watching sports is fun because you want the team that you root for to win. There are some situations like this year's season that has drawn some of that into question around how it is that we kind of root for a team when the outcomes are different than just winning all the games you can, which is sort of the baseline of sports. Sports were started to win, right? Sports were started to compete, to put your best foot out there, and then to ultimately win. So you enter a situation like the Nets are this year, where that isn't the ultimate goal, because the thought is that to get the highest possible draft pick, you want to be able to, lose games. It just ends up becoming just this very confusing landscape. And then the confusion lends to frustration when things aren't working out. The confusion would be the other way if the Nets were losing every game and we were, as fans, going and watching these things and be like, oh my God, we're going to watch a Wizards-like season right here. Like, what are we doing with ourselves? What are we doing with our time? So the confusion and frustration would end up working both ways. The way it's working now is that it's working in they're winning a few more games than some group of fans, probably including me, thinks that is analytically responsible. But at the end of the day, you want your team to win games, so then things end up becoming frustrating. And then we see that kind of trickle all the way down from the fan level, and then it's talked about on an organizational level, and then ultimately it's talked about on a player level, where Cam Johnson, Nick Claxton, and guys like this are feel compelled to respond to some of the backlash, which Lucas makes a good point in his article, is that doesn't come through at Barclays. Like, no one at Barclays on a night-to-night basis is rooting against shots going in or rooting for misses. Like, that's just not happening. It's not things like this are not trickling down to the fan level like this. It's more in the sort of like the Twitter sphere, the webosphere, right? Like the interwebs of discussion, and then makes its way to people covering the sport, like covering the game on a day-to-day basis, like Lucas or like us that's talking about it here. Is that where this confusion ends up landing? So I think it's definitely worth the read. I think that he makes all the salient points around why this confusion ends up happening, right? It's like, oh, what is happening here? The team is winning games. That should be great, but there's this other competing ideology or this competing set of goals that just kind of stands and slaps it in the face around this isn't what's supposed to happen. And that's just not Nets fans' fault, and it's not the players' fault, and it's not the organization's fault. We've said this tons of times. It's the league's fault for making this the case. It's the league's fault for incentivizing teams to lose this is the only way to sort of gather possible generational talent around the top of the draft. And oftentimes generational talent comes at the top of the draft by and large. And if there's just no other way to do it, then you put the team and you put the players and then ultimately you put the fans in a really tough spot around how to do it. So I would recommend you read Lucas's piece. It's really good. He's a great writer, and he understands it sort of like on all different levels. And it speaks to, I think, the frustration that really everyone is feeling around this stuff, and that we've talked about multiple times. So just trying to sort of square the circle on where that we stand here coming out of the All-Star break, probably what's going to end up happening, why there's going to be a group of people frustrated and confused, and why there would have been a group of people frustrated and confused if it had gone the other way. This is it's a win-lose situation, but the winners and losers end up becoming two sides of the aisle on Nets fandom, and that's just a tough place to be. I want to talk about some of the surprises from the first, not even surprises. We'll talk about some of the highlights from the first first beginning of the season when it comes to the player level. We'll talk about some of the players that maybe have underperformed as well. We'll get into that here in just one moment. All right, before we get to that, tell you about our friends over at TurboTax. This message is sponsored from Intuit TurboTax. Taxes was waiting and wondering and worrying if you're going to get any money back. Then waiting, wondering, and worrying some more. Now Taxes is matching with a TurboTax expert who can do your taxes as soon as today. An expert who gives your taxes their undivided attention as they work on your return, while you get real-time updates on their progress so you can focus on your day. An expert who will find you every deduction possible and file every form, every investment, everything with 100% accuracy, all so you can get the most money back guaranteed. No waiting, no wondering, no worries. Now this is taxes. Get an expert now on TurboTax.com. Only available with TurboTax Live full service, real-time updates only on iOS mobile. See guaranteed details at TurboTax.com/guarantees. All right, so let's talk about a little bit about what we've seen before the All-Star break. Obviously, the biggest probably surprise of the season has been Cam Johnson. I don't think that's all that close in terms of just sort of like what we've seen this year, to the point where Cam had played himself into you would think it to be like high-level trade talks around sort of like what his ultimate value was to other teams. He doesn't get traded at the deadline. We can talk a little bit about whether that was the correct choice or just the choice that the Nets found themselves, or Sean Marks just sort of found himself in terms of, wanting to retain a player who clearly was playing his butt off and probably had already, not even probably, had definitely exceeded expectations around like just sort of what he could do going into this year, right? So if you look at his number, I mean, the numbers are sick so far this year. He's easily the highest true shooting percentage on the team. In fact, his 65.2% true shooting ranks, I think, pretty sure it's second among I went more than 26 minutes a game. So it's like players that are actually playing a bunch, right? He's playing, they're almost 32 minutes a game. Maybe if I dial it back, it looks a little bit different, but it's probably only going to help. It's not going to change too much because most of these guys are centers. When you look at true shooting percentages, usually the highest guys up here are centers because they're the closest to the basket and their shots are typically the easiest, right? Dunks or layups or whatever. So their true shooting, or just the expectation around just how much their shooting is worth and how efficient they are shooting, is going to be higher, because the taller you are and the closer you are to the basket, those numbers are going to just end up being higher. But if you look at his true shooting, really only one other non-center is above him, and that's Christian Braun on the season from the Nuggets. The guys above him: Jared Allen, Walker Kessler, Rudy Gobert, Domantas Sabonis, Nikola Jokic, and then Braun, and then Cam. That's the list. I mean, that's a crazy efficient season he's having so far. I mean, well above. I think we were, I don't know if we were high or low on him coming into the season, but just in terms of sort of like what the expectation was for him coming into the season, I mean, this really, really exceeds it. So he's at 19 points a game. He's 48.8 from the field. So he's darn close to 50% from the field, 41.3 from beyond the arc, and then 89.4 at the line. So he's flirting with the 50-40-90 season. Probably is not going to get there just based on sort of where he is now, and would have to be ultra efficient through the rest of the year. But I mean, whatever. I mean, that's like splitting hairs. The season's been, he'll stick above 40% almost for sure from three. It's just the field goal percentage and the free throw percentage. We'll see if they can tick over those numbers. I think it's probably going to be a tough push for him to get over 50% from just the field. But hey, stranger things and all, he's just shot the lights out of the ball. Has been so good. And you can see probably why, like for him, when it gets frustrating talking about the tank and having to ask questions about the tank and where players stand with it, you can see why he would be frustrated with something like that. The guy's playing his ass off this season. Like, he's been so good. And then a top 50 player in the NBA for sure already. Talked about in trade talks, right? Like, Marks clearly held the line at wanting to get a lot of value or a lot of just draft capital back, maybe 2 first-round picks. I can see why other teams wouldn't have been so pumped about that, but I can also see why Marks held the line here too, because if you have a 28-year-old on it's declining next year and then kind of ticks back to 22.5. This kind of shooting is easily worth these numbers, right? So if you have him on a contract that's easily palatable, right? Like, you can stomach this contract going forward into his age 31 season. It'll likely age okay just because of the shooting. Maybe it's not, it's not hyper athletic. It's not above the rim stuff. It's not on ball creation, but it's a really, really darn good shooter who's played good defense this year. You can see why Marks held the line, but you can probably also see why teams weren't all that into just, wanting to pay the price. And then if you're Sean Marks and you're of the mind that, okay, well, maybe we're going to be out of this tank situation and maybe we're going to be more in the shoot for another superstar situation that comes loose in the offseason possibly, then maybe you want to be able to make sure Cam Johnson's actually on the team. You run into big problems when it comes to salary matching on trading for another superstar, because the Nets don't really have anything besides Nick Claxton, who we're going to talk about shortly, on the books. But ultimately, if you're thinking to yourself, hey, we want to be competitive within 2 years, and that's going to be the out year in Cam Johnson's contract, like, maybe there's a world where keeping him is the right thing to do. And then you couple that with that he's just the consummate professional, super smart, like just understands basketball, really clearly thinks about shooting a ton. If you've listened to him in different just in different interviews, he's like the guy just lives and breathes shooting. Like he wants to dissect this. He did it on JJ Redick's podcast. He did it with Duncan Robinson. Like we've heard this guy talk a lot about shooting in the past. He talked about with Lucas Kaplan too. Like he's talked a lot about shooting. He clearly thinks about it on a very high level. And these are just the kind of guys you sort of want around your team, especially if your team's about to get a whole lot younger, because you're going to drop in, 3 or 4 draft picks onto the team from different parts of the draft. These are the dudes you just do want to have around just in general, because they're just going to show you how to do it the right way. They sort of live and breathe basketball from the highest level of making sure it's technically correct all the way down to the competitive level. And so those are like, you can find lots of reasons to keep a guy like Cam Johnson around if the price is not going to be high. And I don't think that we haven't heard anything that I've seen that has suggested that there was teams offering like a first round pick and players for Cam Johnson. We haven't seen that. If I'm wrong about that, please pass it along. But it's just not something that we've seen reported, which makes me feel like it really wasn't the case. Now, we have seen that Sean Marks was holding a high value of this, and maybe teams were disincentivized from calling and really, asking for it. But I'm just not sure that the returns were going to be what people thought. And if you saw how the rest of the trade market really worked out, I just don't think a lot of those deals were there. I mean, obviously, like guys like Luka get traded, Darren Fox get traded, like Levine's on the move in that Fox trade. There was DeAndre Hunter got traded to Cleveland. I mean, we saw what the return there for him was, right? So like, it's not like there were these other 3-and-D wing kind of guys that were drawing massive hauls in the trade market, right? A couple of these guys moved, but by and large, they didn't. And the prices that came back for them, I think Nets fans would have looked at it and said, well, that's just sort of not worth it. Now, maybe you think it's trade or bust or whatever, but I can see why Sean Marks wouldn't have pulled the trigger there. Ultimately, Cam Johnson's easily been like the best player on the team this year, just on just shooting level, on an overall basketball NBA level. Even though we had decent expectations for him this year, he's well exceeded them, right? He's just well exceeded them. When you're this efficient as a scorer, that's the beginning of the whole name of the game. If you can shoot like this from beyond the arc, if you can sit with those names up there in true shooting, and up there in effective field goal percentage, and just know that if you're just like one of these guys, that is just so crazy valuable. I didn't look at his effective shooting where he was. It was a little effective field. Excuse me, I said effective shooting. Effective field goal is a little bit lower, but I mean, still, if you look at this list, I mean, it's a little lower actually, but it's not so much lower. So still a lot of those same guys are above him. A couple other guys from beyond the arc, like Michael Porter Jr., Peyton Pritchard are up there. I mean, those guys are only taking threes. And like Josh Hart's up there, although he's kind of plays around a lot around the rim too. So overall, just sitting among the best in terms of just efficient shooting, efficient scoring. And it's been a crazy surprise. And one of the reasons the Nets are sitting here with this many wins, like he's just been that good this season. So you love to see it. You always want these guys to play well, no doubt about it. Other sort of short-term surprise. I think we've really liked what we've seen out of Trendon Watford since he came back from injury. Kind of makes you wonder what would have been the case with him going back if he had played the whole year. And he's been very, very good in a versatile role that the Nets have kind of needed without primary ball handlers. So it's a little bit of although I guess he's played 19 games. Wow, I thought Watford had played fewer games. It feels like he's played less, doesn't it? I don't know. Maybe that's just me. I think what we've seen from him overall has been what you like to see. I think he's a guy that will probably stick. Is my guess, right? Like this is an out year for him too, but I could see them bringing him back. This kind of versatility on your roster does really matter because you don't know who you're going to draft. You would think the Nets are going to draft best player available going into this year. And at that point, like you're not positive you're going to get guards. You're not sure you're going to get, we know D'Lo is on his way out. I could see them re-signing him, but I think that we see Watford back on some kind of team friendly deal because I think I have a sense that the Nets will value his skill set maybe a little bit higher than some other teams. All right, we're going to get into some of these other, maybe not so much on the highlight side of things here in a second. Nick Claxton, maybe one guy we'll talk about. We'll talk about if we're going to see Cam Thomas, if and when we're going to see Cam Thomas again. We'll get all into that here in just one moment. Before we get into that, Tell you about our friends over at Hungry Root. When it comes to grocery shopping and meal planning, got this ongoing problem. You don't have time, work, life, trying to eat healthier constantly can be feeling stressed out. You go to the grocery store, you buy things you don't even need, then you end up with no time to actually cook. Then you start thinking about sticking to those health goals. That can be a struggle as well. Everything changes when you discover Hungry Root. It's a total game changer. It's the easiest way to eat healthy without all the stress. With Hungry Root, it's like having a personal shopper and a nutritionist all in one. Take care of the grocery shopper. Recommend meals and groceries based on taste and health goals. Anti-inflammatory, high protein, gluten-free options. There you go. The best part, every meal is ready in 15 minutes or less. Quick, healthy, and actually tastes great. If you are going to love Hungry Root. For a limited time, you're going to get 40% off of your first box and a free item in every box for life. Just go to hungryroot.com/LockedOnNBA and use code LockedOnNBA. That's hungryroot.com/LockedOnNBA. Code LockedOnNBA to get 40% off your first box and a free item of choice for life. hungryroot.com/LockedOnNBA. Code LockedOnNBA. Don't miss out. All right, when we talk about seasons that maybe haven't gone exactly as expected, there are a few on the Nets ledger here. Obviously, you don't become a 20, and even though they've exceeded as a team, I don't think you don't end up at 20 and 35 on the season without a few guys who maybe are underperforming expectations, even with the understanding that this Nets roster has considerably less talent than most other NBA teams out there. Although some veteran presence and just they've worked really hard and played really hard. So none of this is going to be about an effort level stuff. What I'm going to say next, I just want to be really clear about that. I think the effort really, especially of late from everyone, has been awesome, which is really saying something on a team that stinks. I mean, if you look at, or a team that was supposed to stink, if you look across the NBA landscape, it doesn't take much to find some of these other teams that are totally unwatchable. I like the Wizards. And this goes back to what I was saying at the beginning, where it's like, okay, well, what do we want here? Because the other version of this is your Wizards, and it's completely and utterly unwatchable on a night-to-night basis. Yeah, they're going to have a higher draft lottery odds, but they completely stink. And, that's a hard way to go through the season. So everything I'm about to say next is not on an effort level piece. I think that we've seen effort level high from every single guy, and I think Jordi Fernandez has held them to a really high standard over the course of the season, which is why you see the effort work out. It's why they have so many wins. The effort, they just do out effort people almost every single night. Like they've won a lot of these close games. They've been able to just outperform expectations, and the effort has a huge deal with it. So anyway, insane amount of caveats there to start, but that is what it is. All right. So the first guy, one of these guys that's just had, I would say, a disappointing season is just Nick Claxton. So Nick Claxton signed the contract and he got paid. And I think that contract sort of made a lot of sense, a little bit team friendly. We thought we'd maybe see some other suitors outside of the organization, but ultimately he ends up coming back. But the on the court stuff has just been rough this season. His net rating right now is one of the worst in the league, -12.5. And everybody below him, so wherever you want to rank, is basically a Wizards guy, something we've talked about beforehand. Like every other guy with this net rating that's worse has been, or except for Kuzma, who's now on the Bucks, has been played most of their time on the Wizards. So Kuzma -19.3, Bub Carrington, Alex Sarr, Bilal Coulibaly, and Jordan Poole. Those are the guys that have worse net ratings than Nick Claxton, and then Keyshawn George is another Wizard that's below him, or that they're right in the same range as well. So basically surrounded by other Wizards players, and Claxton, they just have lost a ton of the minutes he's been on the court, right? Some of that is because he's going against other team starters for sure. Sometimes it's because they're not playing with a true point guard, which you do need to be able to unlock some of his skills. There maybe was a little effort stuff early on in the season. So I'm always hesitant a little to say that, because I think it's hard to tell just by watching the games on the effort level, and maybe your eyes can fool you going either way on something like that. It does feel like there's been sort of a motivational shift in him of late, but that could just be me, kind of thinking that. I'm not really positive. Maybe it's just been the same the whole time, but ultimately his numbers just aren't really what you would have wanted going into this season, right? They've kind of been brutalized when he's been on the court as the center. A lot of the other rate stats just aren't really keeping pace with where he's been in the past. And for a guy who's making $20 million a year now, this is sort of always what happens when the expectations get ramped up, right? We talk about expectations relative to other things. In this case, expectations relative to money and contract do end up mattering, right? Like a player can be great at 2 million and maybe be a problem at 20 million, right? And so like these are just the kinds of things that happen with players when the money becomes part of it, and it's always part of it because there's a salary cap. When the money becomes part of it, then the expectations shift. He's down to 10 points a game. He was at almost 12 last year, but some of that's a minutes based thing. So you'll take it, but the field goal percentage has dropped from 63% to 54.6. So that's a problem. The rebounding has dropped kind of precipitously by 25%. He was a 10 rebound game guy last year. He's 7.5 this year. The blocks went from 2.1 to 1.4. Again, some of this is schematic a little bit, and some of it is just minutes. Like he's only 26.6 minutes as compared to 30. So bump him up a little bit on a per minute basis. But ultimately, I think we could agree that like the sort of the overall performance from him this year, really across kind of every level, has been not what you expected. I mean, we talked about, thinking about him as for trades to maybe contending teams that could slot. We talked about maybe, OKC could use him, play him at the 5, like kind of like play Chet at the 4, right? And like this before Hartenstein went there. The Chet's more of like a 4 spacer now. You just have this like sort of twin towers kind of defensive setup that would be great. And Claxton could switch on to everybody. I think like some of those discussions probably have been tempered because of the play this year. When you do the play plus the contract that goes out, it does decline. 27 this year declines to 20.9 and 27.28. We'll see how that ages, right? Like looks good that it declines with the cap going up, so it's probably fine. But if you're going to be a center that, of his, like the way that he plays sort of around the rim and haven't really become like at the hub of an offense, really. You can run some DHO stuff through him, but like the on the ball stuff's still not amazing. This is just like one of those situations where it does get like a little tricky to be able to figure out the whole value. So do you think Claxton's been something of a disappointment this year? I don't think that's a stretch to go out and say that. And another guy, and it kind of stinks because he's hurt right now, has been Noah Clowney. Like the Noah Clowney situation before he got hurt has been really confusing. Like the rebounding fell off a cliff, right? He's basically only shooting threes. The blocks have been non-existent. Like that's a weird one. And he hasn't been around for a while because of the injury. I am sort of interested to see what happens when it comes back. We talked about it earlier in the season where he was like, his stats from a shooting perspective look more like a shooting guard than they did a power forward or a center, which is just weird. Again, schematic, but if he's going to take all threes, or maybe just the goal was just to take threes this year, just work on the other stuff later. Like you never know sort of what goes on behind closed doors, but the Noah Clowney season has definitely not been the expectation really from a statistical level or just like an eye test level about how they have him playing, right? Like, yes, he started at the 4. Yes, he was starting next to Claxton. If you're going to be a floor spacing 4, then your defensive numbers and rebounding numbers are going to look a little different. So that's taken into account here with this, analysis, but it's just like a weird situation. Like the per minute rebounding is just below where he was last year. The blocks are way below. I mean, they've kind of just gone away, and he's taken 5.6 threes a game at 35%. Like you love to see that from a 4, but that's on 8.1 total field goal attempts on the season, which is just weird. So I'm hoping it's just is sorting itself out to be like, hey, this is what they're pressing the issue on, and this is what they want him to get better at. And schematically, things will end up working out in the end for him. But for sure, this has not been the situation I think that we thought we were going to see from Noah Clowney. So, all right, what to expect from after the All-Star break? Look, I think it's just going to be a lot of player analysis. We'll look more into the draft as the Nets, as where things are going to, sort of shake out with them in terms of drafting. We'll take a look at like sort of where some different players are going to land. And obviously we'll be rolling every single game too, going through the highlights, the lowlights, and everything in between. In the meantime, make sure you're subscribed over on Locked On Nets, wherever you listen, YouTube, Spotify, iTunes, wherever. Free for you to click that button. That's the number one way to help the podcast always get to this part of the pod. Without Adam, one of those quotes from one of those great American poets, we'll just say again, Adam Armbrecht, we're missing you, buddy. He's one of the all-time great poets. We'll be back again tomorrow talking more Brooklyn Nets basketball.